Sorry for the delay. Thank you for inviting us. I'll try to speak slowly as this is translated, but if I speed up too much, please let me know. So let me provide some background to our project and to something I think many of you are interested in. We know that there are institutions all over the world, and institutional care is quite common. In fact, there's, by one estimate, 140 million children who have been orphaned or are parentless around the world, and of those, more than 8 million live in institutions. So institutional care is common throughout the world. It's particularly common in parts of Asia and Eastern Europe, and in some respects, Central and South America. What's interesting about this is that this is not a new problem. So this is a piece from the Journal of the American Medical Association from 1915. And here's the highlight. It says, the best conditions for the infant thus require a home and a mother. The further we get away from these vital necessities of beginning life, the greater will be our failure to get adequate results in trying to help the needy infant. Strange to say, these important conditions have often been overlooked, or at least not sufficiently emphasized by those who are working in this field. So, 100 years ago, we recognized that raising children in institutions is not good for them, and yet we continue to raise children in institutions. So this is an old problem for which we need new solutions. So, roughly 16 years ago, three of us, Professor Fox, Professor Zena, who's a child psychiatrist in New Orleans, and I, launched what we call the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. It takes place in Bucharest, Romania, and it had three goals. One was to examine the effects of institutionalization on brain and behavioral development. This was going to be a unique study in looking at kids still in an institution and how they developed. But more importantly, we also conducted an intervention of foster care, and we wanted to see how children who were removed from the institution and put into foster care developed compared to the kids who remained in the institution, and compared to kids who have never been institutionalized and live with their biological families in the city of Bucharest. And the third goal was to improve the welfare of children in Romania by establishing foster care as an alternative to institutionalization. Closer? Whoa. So, let me give you some project background. What led to many children in Romania being institutionalized was really an experiment in social engineering that was launched by this man, Nicolae Ceausescu. Ceausescu was a shoe cobbler by trade. In 1966, he became the president or the prime minister of the country of Romania, and he had this idea that he could increase his power if he increased the population. So then he had to design a series of decrees or laws to increase the population. And so, with the assumption that more population would give him more power. So he established the menstrual police. These were state gynecologists who conducted monthly checks of women of childbearing age in the workplace who had fewer than 5 kids. So every woman of childbearing age who had fewer than 5 kids was given a physical examination in her workplace. He established a celibacy tax so that any family that had more than 2 kids got a stipend, but if you had fewer than 5, you were taxed. So the bottom line is, if you had fewer than 5 children, you were heavily taxed. And then he outlawed all contraception and abortion. So the combination of no contraception, no abortion, tax on families with fewer than 5 kids, making sure women were not using birth control or having abortions by doing physical exams on them, led to a huge explosion in the birth rate. And the result was child abandonment became a national disaster. Families were having kids that they couldn't keep. Ceausescu very conveniently started building state-run institutions around the country, convincing people that the state would do a better job of raising those children than families would. It's a communist country. And as a result, families started giving up their kids to these state-run institutions. And this essentially destroyed the family unit and led to thousands of kids being raised in institutions. 1989, in December, there's a coup. Ceausescu is overthrown, and a new government comes in. At this point in time, roughly in January of 1990, the Western media floods into Romania to see what's been going on, because before that, it was no one from the West was allowed to visit. And what they discovered was more than 170,000 children had been warehoused in institutions throughout the country. Poverty was the number one reason often for child abandonment, but we all know that there are many poor people who don't give up their kids. So there was something else going on in addition to poverty. The international media brought the attention of the plight of these children to the world, and large numbers of these kids started to then be adopted internationally into the UK, Canada, and the United States in particular. And the problem was that the parents who were adopting these children had no idea what the developmental histories of their kids were going to be like. And as a result, they found themselves faced with the situation where many of the kids they were adopting had a lot of developmental problems and developmental needs, and they didn't know what to do. And they were under the mistaken assumption that if they just loved them enough, they'd be fine. The idea was that if they had been deprived and now they're in a good family, that's all that it would take to fix them. And as our study will show you, that's not the case. So these are some scenes from institutions in Romania. You've seen pictures like this before. The sterile rooms with many cribs with babies in them, large numbers of babies to a few number of caregivers. We can ask ourselves what characterizes life in an institution. There's isolation. Kids are left alone, as you can see in the cribs here. There's a high degree of regimentation. So all kids are sleep at the same time, toilet at the same time, nap at the same time, so on and so forth. And they just line up. The other thing that happened in Romania is that you'll notice that it's sometimes difficult to tell who's a boy and who's a girl. And the reason for that is that in the sort of this communist system, they tried to minimize individual differences. So they had similar haircuts and they dressed similarly. So that's the issue of the lack of individual identity and an unfavorable ratio of kids to caregivers, by which I mean there might be one caregiver to keep an eye on 8 to 12 kids, and as they got older, it might even be a less favorable ratio. I don't know if this is going to play. That's what I was afraid of. So this movie file didn't transfer, and so I can't play this. But what you would see here is about 10 to 12 kids in a room really walking around independently, and then soon all of them are engaging in a stereotypy like rocking. And some of you recognize that. So this is where we set up our lab. What happened was that in the year 1999 or so, we were invited in to do a study of kids in institutions by the then Minister of Child Protection. He had been opposed to institutions, but he could not convince any of his colleagues of the utility of closing down institutions. So he thought if he conducted a scientific study that definitively showed that kids in institutions don't do as well as kids living in families, that would persuade policymakers. So he invited us in to do the study, and there are 6 institutions throughout the city of Bucharest. We were physically based in one of them, which is called St. Catherine's. Here's a picture of St. Catherine's. At one point in time, this one institution had 1,000 children in it. So in any given week, children would come into contact with a large number of professionals and paraprofessionals. There might be 17 caregivers working rotating shifts of 8 hours apiece, housekeepers, nurses, educators, psychologists, and the like. So the point is that there was not a lot of continuity. Any given child was being taken care of and being seen by many, many, many different adults, not one or two to whom that child could develop a relationship. So why might institutional rearing be bad for the brain? It's a regimented daily schedule giving you no sort of ability to express individual differences. Non-individualized care. So a good way to think of this, I have to put the microphone down. Hold the microphone for me, sir. This is how the babies would be fed. The food would just be shoveled into their mouth, but it wasn't like this, it was like this. So there was no face-to-face contact. sensory, social, emotional, cognitive, and linguistic deprivation. For young babies, they often would have a room of babies lying in cribs, staring at a white ceiling, and really getting no stimulation at all. And as they got to be a little bit older and they could walk around, they'd put them on the floor, but again, no one would pay attention to them. Hence the rocking that you would see, which is a form of self-stimulation. No response to distress. A very disconcerting thing when you walked into these institutions is how quiet they were. And the reason is that babies learn not to cry because no one pays attention to them if they cry. Unchecked aggression. Kids will routinely act aggressively towards other kids, and no one interferes with that. A lack of a psychological investment by our caregivers. So that's, I think, the key issue here. These were paid women who had no training at all in child development. It was just a job. They all dressed alike. They all wore bathrobes and slippers, and their job was to just keep an eye on the kids, but they didn't really invest in the children the way a parent or a family would invest in the child. And again, as I've said repeatedly, there's an unfavorable ratio of kids to caregivers. So there might be one woman taking care of 12 to 15 children, and rotating shifts of caregivers. So what have we learned from 50 years of children growing up in institutions? Because in some respects, this literature goes back many, many years. There were early studies in the 30s and 40s, and then in the 1960s and 70s, it started picking up. If we summarize this, we know that growth stunting is common. So these are kids who don't grow. So I want you to look at this this kid here and realize this is a 17-year-old girl. So you can see how small these kids are. And the stunting is not malnutrition, it's psychosocial dwarfism. It's the kind of thing that occurs under conditions of profound neglect. The brain doesn't produce growth hormone, and as a result, children don't grow. There are cognitive delays and impairments, a reduction in IQ, a problem in executive functions. Executive functions are these sort of higher cognitive functions like planning ability or cognitive flexibility. You see disturbances and delays in attachment and social relatedness, a high prevalence of psychopathology, mental health problems, including anxiety, and then a whole slew of externalizing problems like ADHD is attention deficit disorder, disruptive behavior disorder, conduct disorder, callous and emotional traits. And in some respects, some people have argued that this constellation of behaviors is almost like a syndrome. So in our study, and my job now is to lay out the design of our study, including the intervention we did, and the ethics in the study, and then turn things over to my colleague, Professor Fox, who's going to summarize the findings. So we wanted all children under 2 years of age, and we wanted them to be reasonably, to be healthy. So we screened more than 180 kids by a pediatric exam. So we had a pediatrician and a pediatric nurse practitioner who screened more than 180 kids to make sure none of them had an obvious genetic, chromosomal, or neurological problem. So we screened out kids with neuro problems like spina bifida or CP. We screened out kids with frank genetic or chromosomal problems like Down syndrome. And we screened out kids who looked very small, like they were premature. And the reason we did this is that we wanted only a healthy sample, because if we had children... Thank you. Better. If we had children with special needs and our intervention didn't work with them, the government could say, well, see, kids are better off in an institution than in a family. So we wanted to maximize the chances of kids being able to benefit from the intervention, and that led to us screening these kids. So of the 180 screened, we wound up with 136. So these were kids that ranged in age from 6 to 31 months. They were considered to be typically developing or normally developing by the pediatrician. We assessed them all extensively at baseline, and the average age at baseline was 20 months. And then what we did is we randomly assigned 68 of these children to go to a foster care program that I'm going to describe in just a minute, and 68 were randomly assigned to remain in the institution, And then we had 72 who had never been in an institution and lived with their families in the city. Following the baseline assessment, we saw the kids again at 9 months, 18 months, 30 months, 42 months. Around 42 months, we thought we might be ending the project soon. At 54 months, we did a limited assessment, and at that point, the intervention ended, by which I mean, it's not that the kids came out of foster care. We stopped supporting the foster care. We turned it over to the government. And I'll tell you in a minute what our foster care program looked like. So from 54 months on, we have been following up the sample, but the actual intervention formally ended at 54 months. So we thought the study would end there because I was running out of money, but then we found some more money and we saw them again at age 8. And we thought the study would end there because we were running out of money, but we found some more money and we saw them again at age 12. And we thought the study would end there, you know where this is going, but we found more money and we're now finishing a big assessment of them at age 16. So we have studied the same cohort of children for the first 16 years of their lives. Now, we had several ethical regulations, which I'll come to in a few seconds, but I wanted to go through one thing. So, this is So we assessed 187 children. We wound up with 136 here. We excluded 51. We have 136, 68 went to foster care, 68 went to care as usual. We had a policy of non-interference, which means that we expected children to change their group assignments over time. And the reason is that we thought some children would be reunified with their biological parents. Government foster care might start, which didn't exist when we were there. So if you look at age 12, of the original 68 in foster care, only 29 are still in the foster care program that we designed, the MacArthur foster care. 8 were in government foster care, 2 had been adopted, 12 had been reintegrated with their biological family, 5 had been reinstitutionalized. And then 12 dropped out of the study. An example of dropping out was, it turns out that we have some families who never told their kids that they were foster kids. The kids thought that this was their biological family. And the parents didn't want the kids to know, so they dropped out of the study because they were worried that it would come out in the, in the study. Of the 68 in the institutional group, which I call care as usual, 20 at age 12 were still in the institution, 14 were government foster care, 6 had been adopted, 18 had been reintegrated with their biological family. One thing I want to quickly add is that we anticipated this change in group assignment, but when you do a randomized controlled trial like this, the way you analyze your data is based on your original group assignment. So when Professor Fox talks about our findings, it's based on whether you were placed in foster care or into care as usual. We don't care where you actually were living at 5 or 6. And the reason for this is to avoid sample bias. So we don't know how the authorities decided to take a child from the institution and reunite them with the biological family. Maybe they only picked children who smiled a lot. Maybe they picked children who they were paid off for by bribes. If we analyze the data based on where the kids were living, we would have sample bias. But by analyzing the data based on where you were assigned, we don't. So let's use an example. I'm going to do a study of everyone in this room with a new drug for diabetes. You get the drug, you don't get the drug. And I want to compare the drug. Well, it turns out that 1/3 of you have bad side effects from the drug and you drop out. I then only analyze the data from the 2/3 remaining and I see a big effect. So I say the drug works. But that drug worked because I got rid of the 1/3 that had side effects. So the way I should analyze the data is I analyze it to everybody who was given the drug, independent of whether they had side effects or not. So that's the idea of what's called intent to treat. So what are our hypotheses here? That the deficits and developmental delays that result from institutional rearing have their origins in compromised brain development. For the brain to wire correctly, it needs input. This lack of input leads to the underspecification of neural circuits, that is how brain cells get wired up together, or circuits actually get miswired. Institutions, normative input is lacking in kids in institutions, so we should expect errors in brain development. Some domains of function are going to be more dependent on experience than others, and as a result, for those that are dependent on experience, they will depend on experience occurring during what we call critical periods. So, you're all familiar probably with children whose eyes might one eye might wander in their head. They have strabismus or amblyopia, so they can't focus on somebody because one eye is wandering. That needs to be corrected in the first few years of life if the child is to have normal vision. The reason is that there's a critical period in visual input, and if it's not corrected by the time the brain becomes adult-like, there's no more plasticity in the brain to correct for that. And so what we're saying here is that it's not just that much of brain development depends on experiences after birth, it's that it depends on experiences occurring during critical periods. So you all speak Portuguese. You would not be speaking Portuguese if you were born to parents from Brazil but raised in Ecuador or raised in the United States. You would speak the language of that culture. So there's nothing native about that. It's what you're exposed to. So as a result, we expected that the children who got the intervention at the earliest ages would have the better outcomes, because that meant they were being in a more enriched environment during a critical period of brain development. So the three of us have different backgrounds and skills, and we kept arguing about what was most important to study. And as you see here, we study pretty much everything. And if we had the opportunity to do the study again, perhaps here, we'll probably do the same thing. Physical growth, language, social emotional functioning, the caregiving environment, cognition like IQ, temperament, attachment, brain function, brain anatomy. This refers to the parts of the brain that deal with responding to stress, genetics, and mental health. So this is a bad slide, but it shows you the kinds of things that we measured through the age of 16. Baseline 30 months, 42, 54, 8, 12, 16. These are all attachment and caregiver measures. These are attention measures. You can have all these slides, so you don't have to memorize this. Brain measures, biological measures, cognitive measures, physiological measures. So we measured a lot of things. Right now, it takes 4 full sessions to get our 16-year-olds through. Oh, and then these are the mental health measures that we measured. Risk-taking measures, okay, that goes on too long. So let me talk about the foster care intervention and the ethics, and then turn things over to my colleague. So we assume that the primary form of deprivation, besides the obvious things of sensory deprivation and linguistic, was being deprived of good caregiving. So what Charlie and his team did is they developed an intervention, a foster care intervention, that strongly emphasized relationship building. So it was child-centered, it had to be effective, affordable, replicable, culturally sensitive, informed by the latest scientific findings. There was no foster care when we started, so we had to advertise for foster care parents. And my understanding from our meetings the last few days is that Brazil is in a similar situation. You don't have enough foster care families. So we did extensive advertising. Now remember, this was a communist country that had strong biases against people taking kids into their home who were not biologically related to them. They were thought to be, not have the best interests of the child in mind. So after all this advertising and then screening by our team of psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers, we ended up with only 58 families that we thought would be good foster care families. And we placed 68 kids in those 58 families by keeping siblings together, another ethical requirement. All the parents received training, and they were licensed by the government prior to placement. Romanian law required one parent to stay at home with the child. We orchestrated around the needs of the child for a stable, emotionally available, consistent caregiver. We encouraged the foster parent to become emotionally invested in the child as if the child was his or her own. The foster care families received a monthly stipend. We provided all material support like diapers and toys. They had access to a 24-hour on-call pediatrician. Social workers visited the foster care parents every 10 days. They had intensive phone contact with the families. They did a systematic inquiry regarding child behavior and adjustment. So if a parent was having a hard time with dealing with their child, those social workers were all over that, working with the families to help them help their child. When we needed serious support, we had our psychiatrists and psychologists step in to work with those social workers and the families. Foster parents had a support group that was involved in education and support. There was explicit efforts to facilitate attachment, and again, supervision and consultations were deemed done from the US. So either we were there in person on a regular basis, or we had routine Skype calls, like weekly Skype calls with the team to help them help their families. So if you summarize it briefly, it is how to build a strong relationship and invest in these children, and how to help these children with the behavior and emotion problems that they have from having spent time in an institution. Let me close with the ethical considerations. So we did the study in Romania because Romania had a particularly egregious history of having many, many, many institutionalized kids, and because we were invited in by a member of the government to do the study. Romania had an interest in developing policies for intervening with abandoned children. What struck us as interesting is they viewed institutionalization as an intervention. They thought making the kids go back to their families would not be good, so institutions in their mind was the intervention. And we had to convince them that there might be an alternative to an institution, which would be, in our case, foster care. We got informed consent from all the US universities involved and all the local authorities in Romania and all the caregivers, parents, and guardians. And when we could do it, we even got informed consent from the families who had abandoned their kids. We had a policy of non-interference, meaning if the kids could change placement, go from the institution to foster care institution to an adoptive family, they didn't really have much adoption, but all of that was possible. We did not interfere with placement changes. Children were free to change group assignment. That is, they could go from the institution to government foster care. Once the efficacy of the intervention was established, we gave this information to the government. So let me explain that this way. Let's go back to my example of my drug trial with diabetes. You get the drug, you don't. Now in this case, you have no side effects. Every one of you, I cure your diabetes. And I learned this 3 months into the study. Ethically, I then have two options. I have to give you the drug because you cannot be disadvantaged relative to you, or I can't advantage you, so I don't have enough drug. I stop the study, so no one benefits. If we had stopped the study when we looked at our findings and saw how powerful they were, all the kids in foster care would go back to the institution. We didn't have enough foster care to go around, so we couldn't add more kids to foster care. So what we did is we called a press conference where we invited all members of the government and the press to a meeting where we announced our findings that showed the kids in foster care were doing much better than the kids in the institution. And as a result, within a year, the government passed legislation forbidding the institutionalization of any child under 2, and they started government foster care. So they heard us. One way to think of this is we tried to shame the government into doing something better for these kids. We have what's called a Data Safety Monitoring Board. This is an objective group of people in Romania not involved in our study who can get reports from the kids themselves or the families if there's something about what we're doing that they don't like or that makes them uncomfortable. And we meet with them twice a year. So it's sort of an ombudsman. I'm not sure if that exists in Brazil, but it's an objective third party to really protect the kids and the families. If for those of you who are interested, we and others have written extensively about the ethics of this project. I'm giving you the citations for this work here. We can make all these papers available. So basically, We had this policy of non-interference. We could do randomization because there were not enough foster care to go around, and as a result, we could only pick a certain number of kids, and we also kept siblings together, and we had many things in place to protect our children and families at all times. So this is our team here, of investigators, and I think I have a picture fairly recently. So on that note, having described the study, the ethics of the study, and the foster care intervention, I'd like to turn things over to Professor Fox, or should we take questions first?